During the Second World War, the M4 Sherman saw service with all major Allied nations. It was capable, it was reliable, loved by its crews, and produced in the tens of thousands. Initially, it was armed with a dependable 75mm gun, the M3, but later in the war, many were built with a new gun, the 76mm M1. Some say this was an unnecessary change. Some say it didn't happen soon enough. What we do know is that these two guns continued to be fielded side by side for the rest of the war, and in this video I'm going to outline the strengths and weaknesses of both weapons and talk you through the US Army's decision making process. So, which was superior? The 75 or the 76? From the very beginning, the Sherman's turret was designed to be able to accommodate either the 75mm M3, a 105mm howitzer, or a yet undefined 3-inch gun, 76.2mm. The US already had a 3-inch tank gun, the M7, but this had been adapted from a 20-year-old anti-aircraft gun, and was too big and too heavy for practical use in the Sherman. By 1942 though, material science had come a long way, and the US had two options. Do you want the same performance as the 3-inch M7 in a lighter package, or do you want a gun with better performance as the 3-inch that was around the same size and weight? They decided to pursue both options and developed two guns, which would emerge as the 76mm M1 and the 90mm M3. For this video, we're going to pretend the 90mm doesn't exist. The 76mm has all the excitement we need. The 76mm M1 used the same projectiles as the 3-inch M7, but with a different cartridge case. So why is one a 3-inch and one is a 76mm? Because the M10 tank destroyer and M5 anti-tank gun were already in service using the 3-inch gun, so it was important that the incompatible ammunition didn't get mixed up, hence 76mm. This gun, despite having the same ballistic performance as a 3-inch, was lighter and used a breech design very similar to that of the 75mm M3 already in service. These factors meant it could be slapped almost immediately into the turret of a regular Sherman tank, and that's what happened, with the first 76mm armed Shermans being tested at Aberdeen as early as August 1942. It's worth pointing out that the Americans were simply being proactive here. After all, in August 1942, the Tiger had yet to arrive on the battlefield, and the 75mm gun currently on the Sherman was more than adequate against the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs that formed the backbone of Germany's armoured forces. But of course, there's no harm in investigating a punchier, more accurate gun for future use. However, unlike the plucky Brits who were happy enough just cramming 3-inch guns sideways into the Sherman, the Americans were pickier. The longer, heavier gun meant the turret balance was a bit off, and the crew inside didn't have quite enough room to manoeuvre as the breech was farther back. The Americans put a much higher value onto ergonomics than the Brits, and were willing to delay the new vehicle in order to fix this issue. In the end, it was solved by stealing the roomier turret of the T-23 Medium, which had been designed from the ground up to use the bigger gun. The new 76mm armed Shermans went into production in August 1943. And I know you were promised a video comparing the 75 and the 76, and I've just gushed about tank bureaucracy for half a video. I can only apologise. Anyway, we now have two guns that we can actually compare. First, the comparison that all the video gamers are drooling over, Armour Penetration. All these values will be against rolled homogeneous armour at 90 degrees. And for context, here are the frontal armour values of some German tanks. Okay, firing their standard solid core AP rounds, the 75's M72 could penetrate 109mm of armour at 100 metres, 76 at 1 km, and 51 at 2 km. The 76's M79 AP, meanwhile, penetrated 154mm at 100 metres, 107 at a kilometre, and 72 at 2 km. For APC, a capped round with a small amount of explosive filler, it was a similar difference. For the 75, the M61 could penetrate 88mm at 100 metres, 73 at a kilometre, and 59 at 2 km, while the 76's M62 could punch through 125mm at 100 meters, 106 at a kilometer, and 81 at 2 kilometers. So, firing AP, the 76 penetrated roughly 42% more armor than the 75. Firing APC, this increased, going through around 45% more armor and doing even better than that at longer ranges. And this can be put down to the increased muzzle velocity of the 76mm gun, which propelled AP and APC rounds at just under 800 meters a second. Shells from the 75 were around 30% slower, with rounds leaving the barrel at just 618 meters a second. The 76mm gun could penetrate significantly more armor than the 75 using equivalent ammunition and was more accurate when it did so, 2 points for the 76. And this is the part where lots of enlightened tank experts will push their glasses up their noses and point out incredibly smugly that the majority of the time tanks were not firing at other tanks. And yes, roughly 70% of shots fired by US tankers during the war were high explosive rounds, fired at infantry, structures, or other soft targets. So let's compare the high explosive rounds of these guns, and this is no real contest. The 75mm HE round packed about 680 grams of explosive filler, while the 76s only contained 410 grams. This meant that per HE round, the 75mm packed 65% more of a punch. In fact, this post-war comparison of the US Army's main tank guns showed that the 76mm came dead last in terms of producing shrapnel from an HE round, while the 75mm managed to beat the 90mm to clinch second place behind the 105. It was the clear king of shooting everything that wasn't a tank. I mentioned that 70% of the shells fired were HE, 20% were some form of anti-tank round, and the other 10% were smokes. The 75mm smoke round was the M64, which exploded on impact to release a thick, choking, incendiary cloud of white phosphorus, excellent for blinding an enemy tank, clearing a building, or putting in front of friendly troops to hide them from the enemy. The 76mm smoke round was the M88, which didn't explode on impact, but slowly released a curtain of smoke, which had a lot less utility for the crew. That, and it took a long time to get into theatre, so most 76mm armed tanks in 1944 had no smoke rounds at all, and this is not good. Another reason to have the 75. But the 76 produced smoke alright, just in the wrong places. The early 76mm guns had a big muzzle blast, kicking up dust and leaving lingering smoke at the end of the barrel that obscured the crew's view. This was eventually remedied with those iconic muzzle brakes and by tweaking the primer, but many crews simply had to soldier on with their hazy guns. Wasn't an issue with the trusty 75. However, as the war progressed, these problems were gradually fixed. The 76mm was still a great all-round gun with punchy anti-tank performance. The HE round wasn't ideal, but it was good enough. The Allies had plenty of options for blowing up squishy things, I suppose, including the very handsome 105mm armed M4. But the real clincher for the 76mm emerging as the winner, for the US Army at least, was longevity. 76mm armed Shermans continued to serve after the war, successfully tangling with communist T-34-85s in Korea. And this was partly because of this, the M93 high-velocity armor-piercing. HVAP was the American APCR round, armor-piercing composite rigid, that contained a core of tungsten that could punch through an incredible amount of armor. We're talking 239mm of rolled homogeneous armor at 100 meters, 175 at a kilometer, and 124 at 2 kilometers. A pretty devious little round. It did have its own drawbacks, of course, requiring a lot of expensive tungsten and not producing as much damage once it did penetrate, but the 75mm had no such round. So here's the final rundown. For some of you, this may not have been a big surprise, but I do hope you learned something. The 76mm, unsurprisingly, is the far superior anti-tank platform, but offering only decent to mediocre anti-infantry performance. The 75 was the other way around, packing excellent HE and smoke rounds, but maybe only offering middling anti-tank performance by the end of the war. It's worth noting that they were almost always used together anyway, so the US tankers got the benefits of both with no real drawbacks. The 76mm tank still had HE as well as two 30 cals and a 50 cal on the roof, so it wasn't exactly impotent against soft targets. And in the same vein, the most likely enemy tank to find in the ETO was the Panzer IV, and the average engagement distance was less than a kilometre. So chances were that the 75mm was still more than enough against enemy armour. Obviously the 76mm looks far better, but I felt a bit mean giving it any points for that. After all, it's not about the size of your main gun, it's what you do with it. Hope you enjoyed this one, folks. A like below would be really appreciated if you did. Thanks very much to my patrons for allowing me to make content like this. Have a great Christmas, lots to come in the new year. Cheers.